Well, one thing that doesn't play a very large part in it, as I conceive it, is advanced technology, robot slaves, to do all the hard work. Aside from the fact that the development of technology has the exact opposite effect. Unemployment is not the same thing as the abolition of work. I mean, it's related to work, and it's worse than work if you need to work. Well, what I had no opportunity to go into is if we can break down the distinction between work and play, then there could be a new type of creative activity, of free activity, which would satisfy both our emotional and aspirational needs and our material needs. If we define work as compulsory production, okay, and play as activity done for its own satisfaction, then we see that they're not opposites. They're different, but they can overlap. I mean, even now you find the occasional person who loves his job. People who have been in these basic income experiments, they're supposed to quit their jobs if they don't have to work, but most of them do not. Even though those jobs are hardly as fulfilling as some productive play activities might be. So, and that is not really a technological issue, it's social. It's behavior and organization. And to make that work on a more than individual scale, the diversity of individuals, which we've been hearing so much about, is not an impediment. In fact, it's a necessary feature of it, because not everybody likes the same things, not everybody can do the same things, but the more of us there are in on this, the more things could be done by those who like to do them and who are able to do them. So to break that down, utopians are always doing that. They want to abolish the distinction between production and consumption. That's another way of looking at what I just said. That's how Paul Goodman described it. Separation of town and country. You could imagine conditions of decentralization, like pretty far-reaching decentralization, would be necessary in order for people to be able to work with each other on a human scale. So that would well involve considerable de-urbanization, although I can't rule out the possibility of doing perhaps a lot of interesting things in our existing cities. So that's roughly what I think about. And I don't know how to abolish his job, her job, because I don't know their jobs. And for that matter, I don't know them, because there's nobody over there. And so I'm not an avocational guidance counselor. I can't give people advice on where to stick your shitty job, or what you should do. Should I drop out? Should I should I embezzle paper clips, or what should I do? Join a union? I have no advice along those lines. But it makes perfect sense for people who know each other or are similarly situated to look at these specific situations with an eye toward, can they be transformed in a favorable way, or is this something we really have to do if nobody wants to do it? And I don't know if there are things that are absolutely like that. If there are, well, the fallback is, even if everything you do can't be satisfying, at least it could be diverse enough to be interesting and to exercise different capacities. So variety of work is, to some extent, an independent value from the fulfilling creative work, because several dull jobs are relatively I mean, Fourier, Charles Fourier, wrote the most about this and the first about this, contemplated, he thought that everybody had dominant passions, some more than others, which needed to be satisfied by what he called attractive labor. And he was envisaging mostly agricultural situation, or gardening might be a better way to put it, in which no one would do the same thing for more than half an hour. You might be working on the peas now, maybe you'll deal with the apples in an hour, that sort of a thing. And to consider that, a specific practical proposal would be to miss the point. If you if you have a really good grasp of classical anarchism, you can find some elements of the things I'm proposing in, for instance, Kropotkin and some other people. But it hasn't been a foremost theme along the way. For most of them, they were still thinking about the evils of work as Marxists think of them. And I wasn't able to have time to quote him, but William Morris once said, he says, well, all of us workers, we want, social control of the means of production. We want, less work. We want the full product of our labor. And he says, I'm sure that many of the comrades would be satisfied to stop right there. But he said, I'm not satisfied, because I'm not going to be satisfied until work becomes part of the pleasure of our lives. And Morris is the other. Those are the two people that most interest me on this topic, and maybe are the closest to the position I'm trying to articulate. Neither of whom was officially an anarchist. Fourier, because there were nobody calling themselves anarchists then, and Morris, because he was a Marxist, but an anti-parliamentary Marxist, had some dealings with anarchists because they were also anti-parliamentary. In fact, they were in the same organization. But ultimately, he did not get along with them. He did not agree with he did not eliminate the possibility of, social compulsion. And yet, it doesn't matter what they called themselves. Tolstoy refused to call himself an anarchist, although he obviously was, simply because he did not want to be identified with the anarchists who, in his time, some of them were engaging in terrorism and so forth. So it's almost just a terminological difference there. So when I look at people that have contributed a great deal, or a small, some are anarchists, and some are anarchists who think they are. Some are anarchists who don't think they are or don't admit it, and some of them aren't anarchists at all. So that's fine. As for where this figures in the history of anarchism, I would say it has not been a major issue among anarchists until I made it one. I think I can almost fairly, although there were people that preceded me that were direct influence, such as John Zerzan. So now this position is by no means generally shared. Some of the class struggle anarchists who are so concerned about the liberation of workers somehow manage to separate the question of workers from the question of work, as if they don't really know what work is, or that's what workers do. And people of that persuasion mostly will not enter into any debate over it. They either ignore the matter and talk about, we've just organized a hot dog stand in Portland, Oregon. Or sometimes, you get some rather trite ridicule, which is really at the same level that you might get from a small town newspaper editor. It doesn't appear to be doing as well as it seemed to be doing 20 years ago, or as well as I thought it might be doing by now. because we have come up from a position in the 1960s of near extinction, and then began a very slow increase, I think internationally, certainly in more than one country, in the 70s, and then much more so in the 80s. And this was partly, I think, because this was simultaneous with the marginals milieu, the self-help subculture, the zines, the cassette recordings, the do-it-yourself, by yourself or in small groups things. That has an affinity with anarchism. You can call that anarchistic, although you don't have. You could do a fascist fanzines. In fact, it's been done. But there's a contradiction between the form and the content in that case, and so it's not surprising that many of the people who were involved in that scene, who would now be on the internet, did identify as anarchists to some extent, and they were. So, but what I see happening now is, we might also add, then along came the punk anarchists, who, from a position of probably knowing very little about it, except you're supposed to wave a black flag and so on, from that not very promising beginning, considerable numbers of people, most of whom didn't continue to be punks, or didn't continue to be anarchists, for that matter. This added, both youth and numbers, although not a lot of theoretical sophistication. But the detracting part of that is that anarchism should not be a subculture or part of a subculture, which is that's dooms you to distinction. I think it's fine if you want to wear a safety pin in your nose, but I don't want you to scare away the grandmothers who might want to be anarchists, because if they didn't know that you were one. And I think my main villain, and this may be a personal prejudice, because definitely personal experiences go into it, publishers. Several anarchist book publishers began in the 80s. There are several more, and at the same time that the anarchist periodical press was steadily declining from maybe a peak in the 80s to a very low state in the United States anyway, we find AK Press, notably, and some others like that, who are self-described anarchist publishers and who have a publishing program, though, which is, mostly it's not anarchistic at all. And when it is something that can be considered anarchism, it's always organizational, identity politics, that especially I don't understand, workerist in a very narrow way, and maybe the worst thing is a dangerous weakness for democracy. A major division among anarchists, which probably largely overlaps the distinction on work, is democracy. Is anarchism, as David Graeber believes, the purest, best form of direct democracy, the first one that is complete and entire, or is it another system of government, but more insidious? Is it really that different from representative democracy? And I've written a lot about that. In recent years, much more about that than about work. And I've made arguments that when you look at the faults that are assigned to these two types of democracy, some of them they have in common. Some belong to only one of them, but others belong to the other. I'd rather not go through an example, although I have my pamphlet on the subject up in my room. So that, and the people who are promoting the democracy line tend to be the publishers and the academic anarchists. There are not too many of them, but and people like David Graeber, Cindy Milstein, several others may remain unmentioned. And
Noam Chomsky, maybe?
he is so far off beyond, beneath any kind of anarchism that I wouldn't. I mean, you know, I've vilified him at great length. But by the way, his only remaining publisher, I believe, at this time, is AK Press. And they promote him heavily, and I'm told that they sell a lot of his books. And mostly what he's written in the last 30 years, I was greatly influenced by Chomsky at one time, but not because of his anarchism. But I was, impressed by his critique of American foreign policy and the mainstream media. Well, he's written that book now 20 times. Since every year or two, there's another year or two of misbehavior by the United States government and the mainstream media. So that's fine, I guess, to keep that up to date for younger people as they come along. But so he has this massive shelf of books. But the only one called Chomsky on Anarchism is about less than 300 pages. And I argued in a review that because of duplications and things that just didn't belong there, that probably all of his anarchism could be distilled into a pamphlet.